Hello everybody and welcome back to Grim Dawn. In our Newcomer's Guide today, we've made it to Shaman Day in our class mini-series, and I'm full of excitement for this one. The Shaman class is mostly focused on lightning, bleeding, and physical damage, with a minor in vitality. Before we howl at the moon and summon the storm, consider liking, commenting, and subscribing your heart out to the wilds themselves. We do have these YouTube demons to appease, so I appreciate every single one of you for doing even any of that small stuff. Now we begin our active ability journey with the one and only Savagery. Savagery is an auto attack replacement that spools up, quote unquote, based on the number of charges you can stack up. So think of it like a minigun. The more attacking that you do, the faster that it goes. You gain charges per auto, and they buff the weapon, lightning, and bleeding damage that the ability does. And then there are 6 charge levels at level 1. And then once the 6th charge is reached, you'll be dealing basically double damage. So double everything that we mentioned earlier. Charge levels increase up to 8 charge levels at maximum rank. And then the mastery for the first mastery for Savagery is called Might of the Bear. It is only usable with a two-handed weapon, which is a pretty big theme for the Shaman class, and this is going to modify your total damage up to 18% while providing physical resistance. Next up is the Tenacity of the Boar, which will give Savagery slow resistance as well, offensive ability, and a really big jump in health regen, so some really good defensive stats on top of offensive ability for an ability that's just going to take over your auto attacks, which is really helpful if you're doing a lot of auto attacking. Tenacity and really Savagery itself is really powerful in the hands of a tanky melee class, and you'll see me talk about that for the rest of this video series and probably the rest of my anything playing this game, because tanky melee classes are super fun no matter what game you're playing. The last mastery on the line for this ability, though, is called Storm Touched and is more damage focused, giving us flat electrocute, buffed physical, and a chance to buff our lightning damage by a lot. So it's also going to give us attack speed and a buff to your lightning retaliation, but more attack speed means faster charge levels, meaning that you can get up to maximum damage faster, assuming everything in the room isn't already dead. So also another thing I'd recommend is if you have the Storm card shield in your build, I can promise you that the stats work insanely well with Savagery. If you are going for a single-handed melee-focused shield build, that shield specifically, which isn't very hard to find, does come with some pretty significant lightning retaliation damage as a stat. So take that, add it to Savagery, have yourself a fantastic time, and watch enemies just kill themselves on your shield. Our next active ability is a one-shot spammable bug bomb called Devouring Swarm. Now, I've been trying to figure out a good way to focus a build around this ability, but I keep getting sidetracked. So Devouring Swarm is going to hit in an AoE. It's going to deal flat vitality and bleeding damage, reduce resistances for both vitality and bleeding damage as well, all while converting a percentage of that damage to health. The numbers are pretty small, I know, but when you can spam this ability on a lot of enemies, there are a lot more instances feeding back into you, so it's really cool on paper, and I feel like it can be really cool with the right mindset, the right playstyle, and the right build. Primal Strike is our next ability and is going to call down the lightning extra hard. Now, you have to have a two-handed weapon, but I don't think that's a hard sell for a lot of people. And Primal Strike is going to rain down lightning that deals your weapon damage, lightning, physical, and bleeding damage, and then it is going to stun targets hit as well. This ability is an absolute workhorse at both clearing big mobs and dealing big damage to bosses. Thunderous Strike is the first modifier for the ability and will actually take us into spammable territory. We lose a pretty huge amount of damage, but we increase the stun duration to double, reduce the energy cost, and completely remove the cooldown. You can cast Primal Strike as often as you can cast Blade Arc if you're opting for something like a Warder, which is a Soldier and a Shaman, by the way. Torrent is the next mastery for Primal Strike and is going to add a chain lightning effect to it. The bounce can affect up to 5 targets at max rank and deals a small portion of your weapon damage with lightning damage added. And Storm Surge is going to mix... I'm sorry. Give me just a second. Nose hates me. I think I've got it. Whew. Man, it's like when you feel great, but your body hasn't gotten the message yet. Anyway, Storm Surge, we're going to add that into the mix, and what you're going to do is get more flat lightning and electrocute damage while buffing physical and bleeding damage. Storm Surge is a pure damage upgrade for this ability, so I wouldn't consider it a must-have for the skill tree, but if you feel like Primal Strike is lacking in the damage department, then there is an option for you to do more. Grasping Vines will be the next one to tempt you on the Shaman menu and has only a single mastery. Grasping Vines will grow a bunch of vines out of the ground, which will do physical and bleeding damage, but more importantly, it's going to slow enemies affected within the AoE. The radius for the ability gets larger the more points that you put in, so it can get pretty huge. And then the one and only mastery for this ability, called Entangling Vines, is going to add some flat vitality decay, buff your physical and bleeding damage, slow enemy attacks, and then add a percentage of your retaliation to the damage as well. It also has a chance to completely immobilize enemies trapped in the patch, so this ability packs a very utility-based punch. I'd highly recommend this for characters who need to stay alive, so characters who need to kite to stay alive, sorry. Melee classes probably won't get as big a use out of this, but when you're playing a ranged, maybe two-handed, or, dual-wielding ranged class, this one you can just lay a patch of slow bleeding damage down, and then rip into the enemies that get stuck in it with your ranged weapon. It's really, really strong, really good for maybe coupling with your Inquisitors or your... we could say Demolitionist for range damage as well. Not that either of those classes have big, bleeding damage attached to them, but we don't really take Grasping Vines for the bleeding damage. We take it for the slows, the AoEs, the big utility effects. Now, we're moving on to all of the summons that the Shaman can call upon. The Shaman only actually has 2 beast summons, but it has 5 in total. 5 total summons, only 2 of them are monsters. We'll start with my favorite of the group, which is the prickly love bug himself, the Briarthorn. Summon Briarthorn is a big boy, and as such, only one can be summoned at a time. He's going to be giving us a boost to all damage, crit damage, health, and energy regen. He's also got a little ability of his own, which will be dealing flat physical and bleeding damage along with physical retaliation. And then Ground Slam is the first mastery that we get for the Briarthorn, which is just a new ability for him. That is going to, I don't feel like it's much of a stretch to understand that he's going to slam the ground. He slams the ground. But the ability is actually way cooler than it sounds. So, it's actually going to launch out projectiles in an AoE using pet damage, flat physical and bleeding damage, and it's also going to stun targets hit by the projectiles. So rather than being a big shockwave that comes up out of the ground, he's actually going to hit the ground. A bunch of spikes are going to shoot out, and those are going to be the things that hit enemies. So really, a little bit deceitful on the name, but really, really way cooler than it is in sound. So this ability also does something called Generating Threat, which will force monsters to attack it. So our big boy gets taunty and tanky, and then we can cap him off with the Emboldening Presence Mastery. So this is an aura that will always be on as long as the Briarthorn is alive, and that is going to provide a buff to all damage, offensive ability, physical and bleeding resistance, and finally buffing our retaliation damage, all of it, all of our retaliation damage. If you're into pet builds, the Briarthorn can hang with the best of them. Plus, it's probably the coolest looking base summon in the game. And I will stick by that critique forever. Even though, I mean, there's some tough competitors like the Reap Spirit and other stuff, I guess. But no, definitely Briarthorn takes the cake. Best one, hands down, best in show. Give the guy the medal. The next summon for the Shaman is actually an invincible summon, but it does have a time limit, and it is called Wind Devil. It's a little bitty tornado that we can spawn 3 of in total, and Wind Devil hits in an AoE, living for 14 seconds and scales off of player bonuses. The cooldown on the ability is 4.5 seconds, so keeping a full trio of Wind Devils isn't the easiest thing to do in the world, but it is possible. Wind Devil deals flat electrocute and physical damage, but also has a chance to impair the aim of enemies hit, meaning blinds them. If we add in the next mastery, Raging Tempest, we're going to get some flat cold damage, slow people, and reduce elemental resistance as well. And then finally, Maelstrom is the last mastery for the Wind Devils, and that's going to let them fire off tiny lightning bolts on top of being tiny tornadoes. So these bolts are going to deal lightning and electrocute damage just like you would expect them to. Wendigo Totem is our next summon, and while it's invincible, it also has a time limit. This totem is going to live for 12 seconds and has 2 abilities in a fairly large radius. Firstly, it's going to heal both a flat amount and a percentage, and secondly, it's going to deal vitality and vitality decay damage in the same AoE. The pulse happens every 0.5 seconds, so it really is a consistent form of healing, especially if you are fighting right on top of it, which you should be. So if we add on Blood Pact, we are going to get some vitality, flat vitality damage, some buffed vitality, and vitality decay, and bleeding damage as well. We're just going to garnish that with some attack converted to health. And the totem there in and of itself is going to heal us in a multitude of ways. So you get the base, you get the mastery upgrade, you're going to be healing from the ability itself, and you're going to be healing from the damage that it converts to health. The real tough part about this ability is fighting inside the AoE and not moving, because ultimately it is a pretty small circle when compared to the entire screen. But really, if you just sit on top of it or recast it, move it around, it does make your class extra thick. I wouldn't say it's very helpful for range classes, because range classes, being you have to move a lot, you're not going to have the ability to stand in the area of effect of the totem by much. Storm Totem is the next of the totems and has a large summon limit compared to Wendigo Totem, as well as a larger lifespan. So still no health, it is still completely invincible. Storm Totem is going to fire off lightning and electrocute damage that will bounce to multiple targets, and there is a 3 summon maximum to this totem. So theoretically, you can have a whole bunch of chain lightning bouncing off of pretty big mobs, and then if you opt for the Corrupted Storm modifier on this ability, you can change all of that lightning damage right into vitality damage. So if you're feeling a vitality cannibal totem build to match maybe your necromantic tendencies, the possibility is there. In fact, I would highly recommend building that sort of thing, especially if you're going necromancer, because any class with vitality damage will sync up really, really nicely with the necro, which is a build that we'll get to very soon. I know I think that's probably the last. Yeah, because tomorrow's the Inquisitor. Necromancer is the last video for the week, so stay tuned. Now, our very last summon is unfortunately not a live forever guy like our Briarthorn, and to be honest, I'd like him a lot more if he was. Primal Spirit is going to live for 20 seconds and has 2 abilities. The first is going to deal physical and bleeding damage, while the second does piercing and poisoning damage while stunning a single target. Spirit is a pretty big guy, so you don't have to worry too much about him dying in the 20 seconds that he's alive. He's just a little more single target focused, and he doesn't have any masteries. Make sure you have your pet attack button bound if you're going to be rocking this lad, because sicking him on a specific enemy is more helpful than just letting him do his own thing. Brute Force is our first passive ability and can only be used with a two-handed weapon. I know you're picking up on that two-handed weapon theme for the Shaman by now. Brute Force is going to add flat lightning damage, it's going to buff physical and internal trauma damage, and it's going to give you increased health. And I don't need to tell you how important health is once you start getting toward the later stages of the game. If you're going to swing a big stick, you gotta have a big health bar. Feral Hunger is the first modifier for it and gives us a % chance to swing in a cleaving area of effect. And then Feral Hunger is going to operate off of weapon damage. It's going to add flat bleeding damage as well. So the coolest part about this ability is going to be the attack damage converted to health. The percentage is really big too, at a max rank coming in at 33%. So when the ability goes off, it's going to deal a lot of damage to a bunch of targets, and you're going to vampire a whole lot of health out of all of them. Looking even more like the Shaman and the Necromancer are just a match made in heaven, if we're being honest. Upheaval is your last option and is going to activate on every swing. The radius is large and deals weapon damage, flat lightning, and flat bleeding damage, and then cleaving with a two-hander like a farmer mowing the crops. Because I think that's surely a thing that farmers do. Right? If you're a farmer, let me know. Passive line number 2 needs to be toggled on, and it is called Mogdrogen's Pact. Mogdrogen's Pact. Man, talking becomes infinitely more difficult when your mouth is full of... Never mind. The ability is, I believe, a requirement for playing a two-handed shieldless shaman class. Pact is going to add flat physical damage, health regen, and energy regen. It also gives physical damage buffs to your pets, which sounds pretty simple, I know. But Heart of the Wild, the second piece to the puzzle, is going to increase your health and health regen by a percentage, while also reducing the duration of bleed and poison effects. Considering that those damage types are pretty prevalent in Act 5, at the very least, you can start to see why I think the path is so important. The Oak Skin is going to be our very last mastery, providing defensive ability, armor, piercing resistance, and aether resistance. It also provides a buff to all of your retaliation in case you really need your defensive abilities to do damage too. It's very subtle, but I cannot overstate the value of the passive. So take it if you are playing a melee shaman, and you'll be happy you did. This entire set of passive abilities is life or death for my current level 100 warder. If I do not have them on, I take extreme amounts more damage, and it is super, super, super noticeable. So do with that as you will. Lastly, the Shaman has 2 exclusive passive abilities. The first is called Stormcaller's Pact. This one is going to give you flat electrocute damage. It's going to buff your crit, buff your cold, and then give a chance to do a ridiculous buff to your lightning damage. It's also going to buff your frostburn and electrocute damage. And if all that damage buffing wasn't enough, it'll go a step further and convert a chunk of your physical damage into lightning damage. So while also reducing stun duration against you, this ability is absolutely nuts for any lightning-focused build. So if you are leaning into, again, those melee-focused lightning two-hander shaman classes, like the warder, which is what I would consider it, Starcaller is a must. Now, your other option is more pet-focused, but also exclusive, so make sure that you pick the one that you actually really want. Primal Bond is going to give you flat damage absorption, flat bleeding damage, buff your physical damage, internal trauma, and bleeding damage as well, while also having you take less damage from beast-type enemies. Given that there are a lot of those out in the bog, at the beginning of Act 5, you can see that this ability is probably pretty rockin' for, any pet. Wow. Any pet-based summoner going into that stage of the game. It's really helpful, just period, though. But All that being said, those are just the player bonuses. So the passive is also going to give your pets flat bleeding damage and go even further beyond by giving them a buff to literally all of the damage that they do and boosting their crits. So Primal Bond is a diamond in the rough as long as you have the monster army to back you up. That does it for the Shaman class, though, everybody. We will be back tomorrow to continue down the path with our first expansion classes, which is the Inquisitor. The Rootinist, Tootinist, Hootinist, Gunslinger, this side of the cattle fields, and really just everything that you want in a shooty guy. The reason that I say expansion classes as well is because the very first base game, or Ashes of Malamuth being the first expansion for the PC release, included the Inquisitor and the Necromancer, and then Forgotten Gods. The final expansion included the Oathkeeper, which will be our very, very last class video. So thanks so much for hanging out. That will do it for this one, everybody. Have yourselves a wonderful day, and I will see you next time.